Welcome to the Shift Left experience.
Here is a trivia for you today. Which country or which society or which city in the world is known as the emotionless society? To answer this question, you might think it would be a city or a country which is torn by war, has a lot of poverty, has a very low GDP, has a very low unemployment rate. But to your surprise and to your shock, that city or that country is Singapore. Now,
Back in the day.
to talk about the good things about Singapore, Singapore has one of the highest GDPs of the world, not only in terms of purchasing power parity but also in terms of nominal GDP. Singapore ranks amongst the fourth country in the world with the highest life expectancy, where the average age of Singaporeans is 83.6 years in 2011. Not only that, the unemployment rate of Singapore too is extremely low as compared to the average unemployment rate of the world. Singapore consistently has not exceeded more than 6% of unemployment rate for the last 20 years since it's been tracked. Singapore is also considered one of the safest cities to live in the world. Why? Because when a survey was conducted with Singaporeans, 95% of its citizens rated Singapore as safe, and it said that it was absolutely safe to roam around the streets. And this is not a survey done for 1 year, but it has been done consistently year after year. Singapore has a very high confidence in their government and rates their government as one of the best. Only 10% of Singaporeans felt that corruption was widespread in the government. When it comes to smartness and literacy, Singapore again rates very high. When asked the question, do you think 10% is bigger than 1 out of 10? Is it the same, or is it smaller than 1 in 10, or is it greater than 1 in 10? 40%, only 40% of the global population can answer this question currently, while in Singapore, 76% of them answer this question currently. Everything is great about the Singaporeans when you look at these indices at these numbers. Also, when you look at or ask Singaporeans in terms of how are they thriving in life, about 1/3 of them rated their lives high enough to be considered as thriving in 2011, when the global average was only 24%. In Singapore, 34% of the people said their life was thriving. But among all these indexes, when you look at Singapore as a city which is really thriving in terms of GDP, in terms of health, in terms of literacy rate, in terms of employment, there is one important index which was found out by the Gallup survey team where Singapore really fell flat. And that index was the positive experience index. Now, the positive experience index is measured on 5 broad parameters, and those parameters are enjoyment, learning or doing something interesting, feeling well rested, smiling and laughing, and feeling treated with respect. And when Singaporeans were surveyed against these metrics, Singapore fell really low. The indexes were really low in 2011. The shocking aspect was not just Singapore had rated low on the positive experience despite all the good things that they have in the city and country, but Singapore was ranked dead last out of the 148 countries in the list of countries which was surveyed by Gallup. Now, Gallup really started thinking into these numbers, and they started surveying people on the negative index. The negative index is a measurement which measures the parameters of anger, stress, sadness, physical pain, and worry. And when Gallup surveyed and asked Singaporeans questions around these metrics, once again, Singaporeans measured or rated the negative experience the lowest amongst all countries. Now, this was very peculiar when a country is not even rating themselves high on the positive index, and which is again rating themselves very low on the negative index too. This really drew attention and focus of the team to understand that it is not necessary that any country who rates very high on the positive experience would have a low negative index. At the same time, someone who rates are very low on the positive index would rate themselves very highly on the negative index. You can have a society which rates themselves very low even on the positive aspects and even on the negative aspects, and this was the case of Singapore. Now the team deep dive further into this aspect and really try to understand what was happening in Singapore during the 2011 phase and why year on year, because this was not a data which was just drawn out that year. They went back to see the trends, and within the trends within the past, they found out similar ratings for Singapore year after year. And few of the reasons that were stated out by the researchers, and they listed out 3 reasons that why Singaporeans would have such a huge emotions deficit, why they are so emotional. And one of the reasons was, initially Singapore was under the British rule until 1960, and then it was briefly part of Malaysia. At that point of time, Singapore had a really low GDP, which was $320 in 1960, which later on rose to $60,000, and later on in 2019 reached $100,000, and which indicates that it was a society which is completely in pursuit and is completely relentless in enriching their lives through money and increasing their GDP. Singaporeans really believe in the 5C culture, and it's it is a culture which is deeply embedded into their DNA. The 5C, which stands for cash, card, credit card, condominiums, and country club memberships. The concept is so well known that it has its own Wikipedia page. Singaporeans work hard, but working hard does not necessarily make people miserable. People tend to get miserable at their work when they really are not able to find purpose, or they're not able to engage at their workplace, and that is what exactly happened with Singaporeans at their workplaces, where they drew great income. It covered for most of their lives course, but how engaged they were, the negative index really brought attention to that point, that the engagement was really low. Singapore's work ethic again is quite famous. The average Singaporean works 45.6 hours in 2015, which is very high for a developed city, and it was only second to Hong Kong, which was 50.1 hours in those times. Third point that came up is that Singapore really excel in modesty. According to Singaporean psychiatrist, he says we are less inclined to make a big show of how we feel. It may be because we are a bit more conservative and tend to keep things to ourselves. Generally, it is found that people in Asian countries rate their lives much lower than others in the West. If you look at Japan, for example, in 2020 World Happiness Report, Japan ranked 58th out of 158 countries, in spite of having a great GDP, in spite of having all the facilities, great infra, great health facilities, and so on and so forth. These are the 3 broad reasons that came out when Gallup surveyed, tried to understand why Singaporeans rated low on the positive indexes as well as the negative indexes, and hence it got a term of being known as an emotionless society. After the survey was conducted, the hype, the PR around this aspect went so wild in Singapore that the indexes started improving in the next surveys onwards, which Gallup states that it could be that people really got behind this and they didn't want to be seen in the negative light when the other parameters and other metrics were really thriving for the country. And later on, the metrics really started improving than what it was in 2011. People who have been to Singapore, I haven't visited the city, but people who have visited Singapore, gave a lot of positive feedback about the country. But we need to really understand the culture that is built in. It is really something which is organic, where people thrive and they work on continuous improvement, or is it something which is driven so deeply into their DNA that they have forgotten how to express their emotions and how to really truly enjoy some of the basic needs and the basic emotions of life?